Hunger, economic collapse, repression, and COVID-19, Venezuelans have seen it all in the last year. For millions of them, the only way out was a safe harbor in another Latin American country. The shootings between the security forces and the guerrillas that forced at least 3,100 residents of the western state of Apure to flee across the border with Colombia in late March were just the latest example. Yet even these desperate escapes seem more complicated as continental backlash against the worst-hit diaspora in the Western Hemisphere grows. An estimated 4 million Venezuelans have left their battered homeland, and 85% of them have landed in another Latin American or Caribbean country. They represent the world's greatest humanitarian calamity after war-torn Syria, but with a fraction of the assistance and care. The Venezuelan refugee crisis has attracted $1.3 billion in aid pledges, while the Syrian refugee crisis has raised $19.9 billion, according to economist Danny Bahar, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. The pandemic has sparked one emergency after another, as regional authorities fighting contagion and the collapse of economies seal borders and reject illegal immigrants. It is estimated that 122,000 Venezuelan immigrants have returned home from Colombia just since the new coronavirus outbreak. Those staying abroad face increasing hostility and scapegoating, sometimes by allegedly sympathetic authorities. Undoubtedly, the flood of refugees adds to the burdens of Venezuela's continental neighbors, who must already care for their own vulnerable populations. The pandemic has destroyed 34 million jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean, according to estimates by the International Labor Organization. Yet growing hostility toward needy newcomers not only exacerbates an unprecedented humanitarian tragedy, it is historically short-sighted and economically dull. The deprivations of the Latin American health emergency could be much greater without the work of these ubiquitous foreigners. An forthcoming International Labor Organization health report has found that many of the 20,000 Venezuelan migrant doctors working in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Peru have helped fight the pandemic. More than 10,000 Venezuelan nurses are on duty in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru. Venezuelans are even more represented among frontline service workers, running errands, fetching food, and filling recipes for the population who cannot leave home. Whether they are voluntary immigrants, who often bring capital and diplomas, or refugees, who come desperate, displaced Venezuelans are an asset disguised as a problem. They sell goods and services that enliven markets and increase tax revenues. Venezuelans who fled across the border to Roraima, in northern Brazil, collected enough taxes in 2018, about $18 million, to offset the cost to the government of their prosecution. Venezuelan expatriates tend to be younger on average than the societies that host them. They are also better educated than their adoptive peers, which represents a brain drain for their hosts. With proper contracts and residence permits, ILO experts argue in a recent study, host countries could harness their skills, experience, and guts to fuel growth, and even improve productivity in the chronically lagging region. We think of migrants as vulnerable, but they produce, consume, and contribute to societies and the economy, said ILO migration specialist Francesco Corella. If they are protected and recognized, that is advantageous for the host state. Let's think of Colombia, where Venezuelans are overrepresented in the sectors most affected by the pandemic. Before COVID-19, at least 12 Venezuelans worked in construction for every 7 Colombians, while 3 times as many Venezuelans worked in high-contact jobs in hotels and restaurants. These workers will be crucial to reviving the Colombian economy after the pandemic, and yet as most of them work off the books, with only a verbal contract and no residency papers, recovery will be hampered. Due to its invisibility, what we are seeing today is not representative of the transformative contribution that Venezuelans could make to their destination countries, Bahar of the Brookings Institution told me. If nations could bring these people out of the shadows, they could make a real contribution to the host economy. Latin Americans are no strangers to the damages and injustices of a closed-door policy. They led the world by opposing former U.S. President Donald Trump's plans to build a border wall. The South American and Central American nations were proud to embrace the human scrap from world wars, pogroms, and misery. Venezuela, in particular, welcomed dissidents, misfits, and neighboring exiles fleeing dictatorships. However, for decades the global proportion of foreigners remained small and easily metabolized by relatively tolerant societies. Demographic changes may explain the recent dyspepsia. Led by Venezuelans, the Chilean population born abroad multiplied by 6, going from 1.3% of the general population in 2002 to almost 8% in 2019. Peru has welcomed some 830,000 Venezuelans, most of them in the last years. Nowhere has the influx been as intense as in Colombia, now a haven for nearly 2 million Venezuelans, nearly 36% of the entire Venezuelan diaspora. Now Venezuelans in Colombia are considered not so much as guests, but as nuisances, beggars, or even criminals. It does not matter that the allegations of job theft or wage suppression by immigrants have not yet been substantiated. A recent study on the increase in crime in the border regions of Colombia revealed that Venezuelans are more likely to be victims of violence than their perpetrators. These nativist narratives are almost a cliché in Europe and the United States, but worryingly new in a region with a legacy of tolerance and surnames from the Balkans to the Levant. When starving Venezuelans crossed the Bolivian Andes to reach Little Colchane in northern Chile, they met with rejection from the nationalists. "We cannot accept that Chile becomes a Venezuela," said right-wing presidential hopeful José Antonio Cast. More surprisingly, Bogotá Mayor Claudia López, perhaps the most prominent openly LGBTQ politician in Latin America, who campaigned under the banner of inclusion, joined the chorus of attackers after a high-profile homicide linked to a Venezuelan immigrant. "We have very violent Venezuelan immigrants here," he said recently. "First they murder and then they steal. What guarantees do we have left for Colombians?" The backlash makes Colombian President Iván Duque's recent initiative to extend temporary protected status to expatriate Venezuelans even more remarkable. Duque's policy grants up to 1.8 million migrants and refugees protection over 10 years, allowing them to work in formal jobs and receive health benefits, including COVID-19 vaccines. Although the move angered many Colombians, migration experts say the policy could help protect domestic workers by removing the incentive to underpay illegal workers. "When immigrants obtain legal status, they enter the labor market on an equal footing," said Corella. "That means it won't cost less to hire them." Venezuela's refugee crisis was a hemispheric challenge even before the pandemic. COVID-19 has aggravated it. However, both emergencies have shown that shunning neighbors in need is not just redoubling injustice, it is also self-harm. Latin America has had enough.